Welcome to Peoples and Things, where we explore human life with technology. I'm Lee Vinsel. Brothers and sisters of the P&T, a little special episode of the show for you here today. This is a recording of a live event that I did with my friend Michael Sacasas that the Bradley Christian Study Center here in Blacksburg, Virginia held. Mike is the director of the Christian Study Center of Gainesville, Florida, and author of the Convivial Society substack, where he writes about various topics having to do with contemporary technology. I heard that Mike was coming to visit, and I thought we might use the opportunity to have a conversation about how to think about human beings, or to use an old phrase, you might say human nature. Because it seems to me that chasing after definitions of technology, in quotation marks, is a losing endeavor. As I've argued in a post on the Peoples and Things newsletter called In the Shadow of Technology, with the quote, word technology in scare quotes, there really is no essence lying behind the word technology, which we use to refer to so many different things that have almost nothing to do with each other. In that post, I suggest we should follow the great historian David Edgerton in avoiding the word technology altogether whenever we can, and we so often can. But if we want to move ahead in the world and, for example, make it a more just and equitable place, and to make societies both environmentally sustainable and capable of supporting human flourishing, we have to have some understanding of what humans are and, for instance, what they need. So often, we are much better off focusing on the question of the human rather than the question of technology. Now, although as a child, I was raised in a conservative Christian household, I'm not in any sense today an Orthodox Christian believer. This is in large part because I am incapable of believing in metaphysical propositions, the kinds of things you find, for example, in religious creeds. Such belief is simply unavailable to me. I just read way too much Friedrich Nietzsche when I was a young person. But one of the things that excites me about what I tend to call philosophical anthropology, thinking in a rigorous way about what human beings are, is that it can allow us to talk across different religious, spiritual, philosophical, and so on traditions. Not that there aren't real and sometimes yawning gaps between such traditions, there are, and Mike and I touch on them a bit in our conversation. But still, I find different traditions are often much closer to one another on these issues than we might expect. Now, in the past few years, one of the places I've found it interesting and useful to have such conversations, which are often called interfaith, but might be better off described as intertradition or something, is the Bradley Christian Study Center here in Blacksburg, which is led by my friend Mike Weaver, another Mike. I was very grateful for the chance to have this conversation with Mike Sacasas. If you haven't already, you can check out my earlier interview with him here on the Peoples and Things podcast, as well as on his The Convivial Society substack. I will also be posting an essay I wrote related to this conversation titled The Inevitability of Philosophical Anthropology on the P&T newsletter. In that piece, I develop an argument that some friends and I have been making over the years that if we do not bother to do the hard work of thinking about what humans are and how they operate, bogus and harmful ideas of human nature sneak in. And I give an example of such bogus images of human beings in that essay. We simply cannot let ourselves off the hook for doing this important work. I hope you enjoy this special episode of the show. Hey, get excited! Well,
hi, everybody. Welcome to a live recording. I think this is the first live recording we've done of the Peoples and Things podcast, which is a podcast about technology studies, is how I think about it. So it's people from the humanities and social sciences who study what I call human life with technology. And I heard my buddy Mike here, who I've been in dialogue with for several years now, was going to come, and we thought we'd have a conversation just as a way to kind of do a public event. And, when we were planning on what to do together, I could go really deep into this. I don't want to do that right now, but I'm often, there's a lot of talk around in technology studies about what technology is. And this is actually debates that go back to the early to mid 20th century. And I find those debates mostly fruitless. I don't think there's like an essence there to be uncovered. It's just a word we use to talk about stuff in various ways. And so I don't find those very helpful. But what I do find helpful is I think a lot of times, especially when we're thinking about like the problems of technology, or people are talking about technology in ways that make them anxious, or things are going wrong, what's really interesting to me is I think it's often about what the human is. And not just what human beings are, but what human beings need, what they need to flourish, and these kinds of things. So I thought that Mike and I would kind of talk through that theme together a little bit. And then we'll just kind of go from there, wherever you all want to talk about once we go open a Q&A. So the way we're going to structure this is that Mike's going to talk for a little while, maybe 20 minutes. And then I'm going to talk for a little while, under 10 minutes. For sure. And then we're just going to kind of go from there. I'll probably ask him a question to get it going, and then we'll start passing around microphones. All right? Does that sound good? So Mike, take it away, please.
All right. Awesome. So I initially, I think I sent Mike a title for this a few months ago that was simply The Question of the Human. And there was sort of an implied allusion to this relatively well-known book in the philosophy of technology by a guy named Martin Heidegger called The Question of Technology. And I knew that what we wanted to do is sort of reframe technology talk around the human. So how about the question of the human? Mike wisely and gently said, maybe not that many people are going to get that inside baseball allusion. So why don't we just put both questions very explicitly right there in the title? I said, Mike, that sounds like a great idea. So we have these two questions, the question of technology, the question of the human. And my first impulse was to say, in many ways, I think what I have found is that these are the same question. These are the same question. Or maybe a better way to put it is that one question always implies the other, right? So it's hard to disentangle these two questions. One of the first things I do when I talk about technology actually is to kind of muddle the term a little bit, which I recently heard you do in a recent podcast, right? And I asked, well, what is technology? I talk a little bit about how that's a relatively recent term used in the way that we use it, and that maybe it's not a very helpful term, right? So definitely an agreement there. If I were to say, look around the room and point at something that you would think of as technology, right? What would fit into that category? And I think pretty much everything you could point to in this room could fit into some definition of technology. And so when we're asking questions like, some people want to ask the question, is technology good? Or are you pro-technology? Are you anti-technology? I want to say the question doesn't make sense to me, right? I'm not sure that's a coherent question because I don't know that I can make one evaluative statement that captures what I think about a toothpick and intercontinental ballistic missiles, right? These are wildly different instances that we tend to group together into this thing. So I think likely, I don't know that we can point to an essence and say this is technology, but we got to take individual cases into consideration. It is sometimes useful, though, to go through that exercise and kind of think about what comes to mind. People often, there's, I forget who says this, you may know this, the definition of technology is anything made after you were born, right? What people think of as say anything made after you were born. The smartphone, that's technology. The refrigerator, no, that's not technology, right? And I don't think that's great. But we can talk about artifacts, individual artifacts as an instance of technology. I think it's helpful to think of systems, right? Systems that maybe make an individual artifact work, right? That smartphone we have in hand is a very discrete object, but it depends on extremely complex systems to make it function. I sometimes even say that there's some value in abstracting the concept even a little bit more to think about ways of thinking, maybe as being technological in character, maybe pushing a little bit more than some people might be comfortable with there. But that's one way of framing the question. Is just, what is it? What are we talking about when we talk about technology? The second thing I think that we could ask is whether, well, the question that very often people want to ask is this technology good technology or is this technology bad? Now, I think this is where we're immediately, I think, pushed into the second question, right? Because if we want to talk about technology beyond like mere functionality, right? Does it work? That's one kind of question, of course, that we could ask of a technology, right? We're hoping that the recording device here works and that when they go to edit this podcast, there is going to be an actual recording there, right? So does it function? But when we want to know whether it is good, we're asking a slightly different kind of question about values, about something a little bit deeper and more normative than simply, is this a well-functioning piece of equipment? So once we're asking that kind of question, then I want to say, well, what is the standard, right? When you want to ask questions that are evaluative in nature, you want to know, well, what is the standard by which we want to judge whether a certain piece of technology is good or bad, even if you were inclined to make that kind of judgment. And I think sometimes we do want to know this. Increasingly, it seems like more people are wanting to ask this question. Fewer people are maybe inclined to just assume that technologies are completely neutral, that really all that matters is what use you put it to. This is the way I think, this is sort of the default way of thinking about technology. I think for many people, the question is not whether this technology is good, but whether I do good things with it? Do I do bad things with it? Is it a matter of what action, so the moral judgment really is about the action that I'm taking. But I think it's worth asking whether there's something more going on the technology side of things. How does it play with human inclinations? Does it shape us in some ways? Does it form us? How does it impact our perception of the world? How does it impact the way I relate with others, right? When it mediates, when tools of communication mediate relationships, how certain systems order our world, either economically or politically. So there's a material infrastructure. Lee, I forget how you ended up defining technology. It's very broad. It's basically, there's a stuff of life, right? All the things that we look about. I this time around, I kind of played with the idea of defining technology as everything that sustains our second nature, right? That is how we as humans sort of work in the world and make our mark in the world and draw things that are implicit in the world and bring them to fruition. And so are there ways in which this material infrastructure isn't just a conduit of our actions, but maybe in some ways constrains, invites, encourages, discourages, prompts us in some ways, leads us to see the world in certain ways, presents us with new choices, right, that we might not have had before a certain technology was in the world, right? So I think there's a more nuanced way of understanding how technologies intersect with our moral lives, with our will, with our thinking, with our relations. And so I'm interested in those questions. And again, then, so the implication then is, well, I see that I eventually have to start talking about what I think is good for people, right? So if I'm asking a question about the moral standing of certain technologies, about how it shapes, directs, pushes, constrains, then the real question I suppose I'm finally pushed to is this good for people? Or is this good for me as a human being? And so the question of technology, in my view, eventually, if you consider it deeply enough, if you go beyond questions of functionality and whether something is working, or whether you're even evaluating technology maybe on its own terms, is it sufficiently efficient, right? Is it optimizing certain functions? Once you push beyond those questions to questions of value and moral judgment, then I think you are implicitly raising this question of the human. So the question of the human then is also a very complex question in some respects, right? Just as I might say of a certain technology, or if asked what is technology, I might point, well, this is technology, or I can point to each of you instances of the human, right, of the human creature in this room. but we need maybe a little bit more to work with, right? And so when we ask the question of the human, I think in part we're asking, well, what is it that makes us human, right? How do we distinguish this particular species in the world from other living organisms, from other living creatures? What is distinct to the human? What is good for the human being? Are we able to answer that question? But this is, I think, an important question to ask. We might even ask the question of purpose, right? So the question of the human maybe raises also the question, the way Wendell Berry puts it in the title of one of his books, what are people for, right? And so these are all questions that I think are very important to put on the table when we're thinking about technologies, whether we're doing that thinking for our own sake. I want to sort of take stock of the shape of the life I'm living. I have certain maybe moral aspirations about the sort of person I want to be in the world, this kind of father I want to be, the kind of husband that I want to be, the kind of citizen that I want to be, the kind of friend that I want to be. We have these aspirations for ourselves, for our characters. Does technology play a role in that? And that question was really the way that I got into all of this to begin with, right? I wasn't interested at first abstractly in the question of technology. I was more interested in these questions of moral and character formation. And at some point, through some reading that I was doing, it seemed like, oh, maybe our tools have something to do with that, right? Maybe they're not just these neutral, inert objects lying around that I put to good and bad uses, but they're maybe part of this overall project of moral and maybe even spiritual formation and character formation. And so as we think more deeply about this, we're asking this question, what are people? What are people for? How can we answer those questions? And then think about our technologies, given a sufficiently, I would say, sufficiently rigorous understanding of the way technologies work, right? So maybe setting aside the idea that they're merely neutral and learning a little bit about their history, learning a little bit about how they interact with social systems and arise out of social systems, learning a little bit about their design, right? The way that certain designs encourage us to take up the tool in certain ways. So there are things that we can learn that can help us be better at understanding and questioning technologies. There are things that we can learn about the human through a variety of disciplines, whether that be psychology or history or sociology or anthropology. There are things we can learn about the human. And we bring this knowledge together and asking these higher questions about purpose, my aspirations. I began to say earlier for myself as an individual, but then also we have aspirations for our communities, the kind of societies that we want to inhabit. And so all of these are questions, perspectives, right? Each of them implies a kind of perspective that we can take, a kind of question we can bring to our technosocial configuration, the configuration of our relationship with technology in the world. A lot of times what I found as I began writing about these areas, these kinds of questions, these topics, is that people did want to rush to a kind of blanket condemnation, right? These technologies are bad. This is a bad technology. It's reactive. Or they took a more positive view, but it was often equally sort of, I don't want to say quite reactive, right? But it was instinctive. Of course, technology is good. Of course, this technology, because it is a technology, because I think all technologies are good, this technology is good. And in both cases, what I found is that there was maybe an unwillingness, or maybe that's too pejorative a term. There in some cases wasn't the sense that there needed to be a little bit more thinking to arrive at better judgments in specific cases of certain artifacts and systems and how they play with human beings and with human society. And so, honestly, the work for me just began with asking questions, right? Not assuming either the techno-optimist or the techno-pessimist position, but trying to get a little bit of critical distance, trying to learn about both of these things that we're thinking about putting in relationship to one another, and learning how I can be a better student of technology and a better student of the human. Now, all of that, kind of preface, but we'll move quickly on from this point. And as I thought about what I might have made as a kind of second title for this talk, I was thinking of how in early modern text you had a these titles and these extremely long subtitles for books. And I thought maybe
Paragraphs.
yeah, paragraph long, maybe not quite that long in this case, right? But I thought maybe I would title this Notes Towards a Provisional Public Anthropology with a View to Informing Private and Collective Judgments about the Development and Adoption of Technology.
Yeah, good.
Right?
Yeah, I like that. That's what we need.
Yeah.
Clearly.
Right. So these and the you can tell the hesitancy in that title too, right? This is not a statement of, it's notes
Towards, yeah.
note toward
Provisional.
Provisional, right. So I want to offer all of those caveats. But I think the word public is important. A public anthropology, right? And by this term anthropology, a kind of understanding of the human, right? Not necessarily the specific academic discipline, although certainly that discipline has something to tell us about this question, right? But what is our theory of the human, right? And we can talk about philosophical anthropology. In religious circles, we might talk about theological anthropology. What is our theory of the human, which includes a sort of theory of what is good for the human, what the human is for. And so here are some thoughts in that direction. I'll kind of lay them out and then transition over to Lee, and then we can have a conversation about this, right? So one of the first things I want to say is that we're going to be working with implicit answers to these questions, whether or not we recognize it, all right? Whether or not we have ever spelled out our theory of the human, or our understanding of what people are for, or our vision of the good life, right? We have some implicit sense, some implicit sense of what the answer to that question is, what that vision is, what that story is that we tell ourselves about what would be good for me, what kind of life would be a good life, right? So part of this is just kind of making explicit things that many of us might implicitly carry within us. Now, those implicit answers, like maybe they are explicit for you, right? Maybe you have in this room thought about that very deeply. You know, it's wonderful if you have, right? But presuming that those answers are implicit, I think the second thing I wanted to say is that they don't come out of nowhere. They don't arise out of a void, right? They're implicit, but that doesn't mean that they were just born in you, right? When you were born, there's some cultural milieu that conveys to us some implicit answer to the question of the human or the purpose of a good life, or what the shape of a good life, what it looks like, or what a just society looks like. This is conveyed to us in a variety of ways, right? Maybe conveyed to us through Hollywood storytelling, through the marketing industry, through our own, familial circles, in the churches we attend, or the university presents us with some understanding, right, of what their ideal graduate is going to look like, what success in the world looks like, thus what they're preparing you for. So there are many ways in which we sort of pick up an implicit understanding of the good life and the purpose of a human being. So the problem, not the problem, but one of the things that we should account for at this point is that these end up being kind of carried within, but they have public consequences, right? And so one of the implicit ideas about the human might be that all of these notions that you have about what it means to be a good life are essentially private, right? That is, they're good for you, and maybe in the confines of your house and family to hold these maybe thick descriptions of the good life, but they are not necessarily something that rises to the level of public concern or things that we carry into the public sphere, right? This is on one theory of what constitutes a public sphere in a pluralist democratic society. And I'm going to suggest that we have a kind of tension here, right? Because so long as I'm talking about something like, I don't know, a pencil and a pad, okay, I can have a rather private account of how I want to relate to pencil and pad. But once we're talking about nuclear technology, we're no longer talking about things that are of private concern, right? These are matters now of public concern. And so and this has happened increasingly. I think one way maybe of telling the story of technological development is to recognize we've constructed increasingly elaborate systems, right, that spanned regions and then the globe. And these systems, the more elaborate and large scale they became, maybe we might also say the more difficult they became to govern, right? that might debate that, right? But at least there's the greater challenge there, particularly when we think about questions of moral concern, right? So it's one thing then to talk about explicit harms when we talk about car accidents and we talk about regulating the speed of cars. We can sort of talk about, well, X number of people died in traffic fatalities, right? So it's very easy to quantify that. And there is a moral dimension to that, to be sure. But one of our complications here is that there's a lot of moral significance that transpires in our lives that is not easily reducible to quantifiable metrics, right? And thus it becomes a little harder to talk about them in the public sphere, excuse me. I'm going to list a couple of other challenges. So kind of these are all a lot of muddying of the water, right, before we proceed any further. There are other challenges I hear sort of people making when, if I were to propose, we need to have some understanding of the human and maybe think about our technology in relation to this ideal that we have for human flourishing. One response that I hear some people making, perhaps in the academy, is that the problem, in fact, is that we've been too humanistic, too human-centered, right, too anthropocentric in our understanding of technology. And for that reason, for example, we've wreaked havoc on the global environment, right? So the problem is not that we've thought too little about the human, is that we've thought too much about the human, right? So that's one challenge I think that needs to be addressed. I think it can, but that's a challenge. I hear others saying that, in fact, any deployment of a normative anthropology, that is, even if you suggest it sort of provisionally, right, measure of humility, any kind of normative anthropology as an evaluative category implies a policing of the boundaries of the human with discriminatory consequences, right? So you run into the risk of so defining the human that you end up excluding certain members of the human community, right? Or we might think of human flourishing in such a way that maybe leaves out those that are disabled or those who are differently abled from this vision of human flourishing that you've constructed, right? So that is certainly a challenge that needs to be addressed. And there are contested views, of course, contested views. One part of the reason we get this story about sort of keeping moral and religious judgments sort of at bay within the confines of the private sector of our lives is because when we bring them into the public sector, we have conflict, because we have conflicting visions of the good life. We have conflicting visions of what human flourishing looks like. And the more serious the claim, right, the more specific the claim, the more volatile the conflict might become, right? And so maybe better to not sort of talk about those things in that context and privatize those dimensions of our experience. Now, totally understandable. Don't have an easy solution for that. But I will say this, that happens to create a context in which we get what I sometimes refer to as sort of the default eschatology of technological modernity, which is posthumanism, right? And so there's no, because eventually when we are asking a question of technology, we are implicitly asking the question of the human. And if we don't have a sufficiently robust answer to that question, then all of a sudden we find that there are no ways of sort of checking, constraining, channeling, right? This is all not necessarily negative, but channeling the technological towards humane ends, because we don't have a sufficiently thick normative account of the human. So there's that. And I've heard others and engaged with others who want to say something like, well, you can't make hard ontological distinctions among nature, the human, and the technological. And so, well, that's a claim to be thought about. I sometimes think about this as cyborg ideology, right? We have always been technological. We have always been cyborgs. There is, I don't want to reject that outright. There's some interesting insights that I think arise from that. But I think that maybe we can describe the human and the natural not as distinct spheres. Certainly, the human being is a part of the created world. The human being is a part of nature, if you want to kind of entertain that distinction. and human beings have been creatures who have deployed technology in the world for a very long time. I don't think that recognizing that continuity, that the fuzziness of those boundaries keeps us necessarily from creating certain categories that help us, again, ask the question of the human and relate our technology to it. And then the last, which seems, I've been thinking about this for a while, writing in this vein for a while, and I would sometimes say this fringe view, and I think maybe is less fringe than it would have been at some point, and that is that there are others that will argue that there is no compelling reason to privilege the existing configuration of what we call the human. Humanity is a work in progress, and technology will usher in a brave new post-human world, and that is to be applauded. And maybe there are, I can think of certain people in particularly well-placed positions in Silicon Valley who espouse some version, right, of this ideal. And so there is that challenge as well. So in essence, I'm sort of collecting and acknowledging and wanting to recognize that what I'm proposing is not a very, simple say it and have it done sort of thing, but that there are real, genuine complexities to be wrestled with here. So the last thing I'll do is simply list some of the things that I think we ought to consider maybe when we are asking this question of the human in relation to technology. One fruitful approach, which I'll just gesture at, and in part because I know that Lee is an admirer of Simone Weil. So Simone Weil wrote one of, I think it was the last published book in her, well, it was actually published after her death, but The Need for Roots, right? So this was a work that was supposed to be a guide for France's reconstruction after World War II. And one of the ways in which she approached this way of mapping what the good society would look like if we're reconstructing it from the ashes of war was to talk about human needs, right? What does the human being need? Now, this is a helpful question, I think, in part because she acknowledged both material and immaterial needs. I think it's important to recognize those categories. And also because it does now push us to sort of distinguish between what we might classify, and again, contested, areas of genuine need, and what are the, if I may use the term, manufactured needs, right? The things that we think we need, but are not in fact essential to our flourishing, but are needs that are good for the techno-economic system. And if we feel them, we defer to it, we buy its goods and services, et cetera. So the question of needs, I think, is a helpful way of approaching this. Other things I think we ought to recognize are the embodied nature of the human being, which implies a set of limits that correspond to our embodiment. Our rational nature, right? So I'm not a rationalist, but I think we're able to think, we're able to reason to some degree, modestly. We search for meaning, right? I think this is implicit in the way I would construe what it is to think, to be a rational creature. And so this is an important part of what it is to be human. We're, I think, irreducibly moral creatures. We want to make moral judgments, right? We're compelled to make moral judgments, to deploy our reason toward that end of making judgments. We are communal, right? We want to break bread together. We want to fellowship together. We want to be known together. Our subjectivity arises out of our communal nature. And then I also want to, with a nod to Alistair McIntyre, say we're not just rational animals, we're dependent rational animals. Part of what we need is one another, right? We're communities of care. We're born in dependency, and if we live long enough, we die in dependency, and there are periods of dependency throughout. And so if I'm sketching out sort of a provisional, right, notes for a provisional public anthropology, these are some of the pieces of the human that I would want to put on the table for debate and discussion. And so the implication here then is when I think about our technology or technological systems, the technologies I welcome into my own life, I want to know how they play with my embodied limits. Do they tempt me to transcend those in a way that is literally unhealthy for me as a biological creature in this world? How do they play with my rational search for meaning in life? Right? How do they play with my desire to make judgments, to make moral judgments, right? But just to use my judgment, which is a way, I think, to borrow, is Miloš's way of talking about it? We want to be implicated in the world, which means you have to make judgments in the world and take responsibility for them. I think we flourish in those contexts when we're able to do that. That also gives us meaning in the world. How does it play with my communal nature? Does it isolate me? Does it push me to relationship? Does it invite me to outsource relationship? And then how does it play with my dependency? Does it encourage the ideal of autonomy, personal autonomy, or does it encourage me to see the ways in which I depend on my fellow human beings? So obviously, lots more could be said. Maybe we'll say some of it tonight, but I'll stop there.
That was great, Mike. No, thank you. Well, I think we agree, so we should just go home.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
so,
Fantastic.
I thought that was really good, and I think that I just want to say a couple things. I've been when I was a philosophy major as an undergrad, and I've especially focused on continental philosophy, and meaning French and German philosophy, basically, for those who don't know that term. And there was a term that came out of German philosophy of the early 20th century, which was philosophical anthropology. And it was like coming up with our own philosophical view of what humans are, is how I understood that. And for me, I feel like, to go to Mike's point, I think we all have understandings, implicit or otherwise, of what humans are, what we are as beings, ourselves and other people. And I think that if we call that an anthropology, we mostly get that anthropology from our own experience and then from what other people tell us through things like art and religion and proverbs and sayings. I was thinking, like, there's a sucker born every minute, and it's like, well, that's true, actually, And then, if we're honest, then we can say, well, we are that sucker very often, with honest with ourselves. And so I think we end up with these kind of implicit ideas about what we are as creatures, and I think that the philosophical part comes in then about, like, how do we think about this well? Because I think that's what philosophy is actually, that the love of wisdom is, like, how do we do the work of figuring out what we are? And I think that does include things like formal forms of social science and humanistic inquiry, but it also includes more informal things. And I think Mike and I are in total disagreement or total agreement about this thing, that it needs to be a kind of open dialogue that brings lots of people in. I mean, we're two white guys up here, so we could start by maybe diversifying from there and thinking about all those kinds of differences that could be brought in. And I also included in that, like, different kinds of humanities and social scientific theories, like, indigenous stuff and Black theory and queer theory and all these kinds of things. And, I think there's a number of risks here, and I think you already highlighted them. I think that we have lots of examples in history of ideas of humanity, like sexist notions like hysteria and very racist notions like IQ, where we pretended we had fairly objective ideas of what humans were that were just like they were actually just pretending to be objective, and they are actually just justifying existing social hierarchies in our society. So I think we have lots of cause to be careful here. And I also think that, and Mike also went into touched on this, but I'll just say it more explicitly, that I also think there are some very hot, hairy, and fractious issues caught up in this. So if we think about, like, how to think about gender as an example of, what humans are, this is a very divisive issue right now, right? And so my normal habit with these kinds of things is not to rush to those and talk through where we think we might find agreement. And mostly I learned that from the maintainer stuff I did. I found that we could have kind of interesting discussions about the importance of maintenance and repair for society that across these traditional boundaries, like left, right, and all this kind of stuff, that were more interesting than kind of going to the hot button issues. Now, the only thing I kind of wanted to go into is a little bit about the risks that happens if we don't think well about, if we just kind of go along with an implicit notion of human being or get it from somewhere. And I wrote an essay called The Inevitability of Philosophical Anthropology, that'll go up in the next couple of weeks, that in honor of Mike coming to visit. And I go into a case there of this guy, John Perry Barlow, who wrote this famous manifesto in 96, I think, called The Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace. And it's this mid-1990s cyber libertarian manifesto of like, we don't want government regulation. Okay, let me just read you the first couple of lines. It's pretty juicy. And let me say, before I go to read this, Barlow is not only kind of early ideologue of the internet, he was also a lyricist for the Grateful Dead, a rancher, and a Republican politician who worked for Dick Cheney. So he's he's totally an interesting character. But I think he got some things wrong in life, so we'll go into that for a second. So here's the first couple lines of this little manifesto. Governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of capital M mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather. Then he goes on from there to argue that the government should just stay out of the internet, no regulation. You know, if we just leave the internet alone to do its own thing, that's going to be the best possible world, okay? Now, I think in the essay, it's very clear he doesn't see some of the technical changes that are going to come in the next couple years. Like, he doesn't see that the open internet, in quotation marks, he doesn't recognize that it came from a government program, actually, and was always full of NSA stuff. He doesn't recognize that at that point. But what he also doesn't see that the internet's going to turn into a bunch of what we call, like, you know, walled gardens, right? That you know, we're going to be in Google or we're going to be in Facebook. It's not going to be primarily the open internet we're going to stay in. It's going to be these things, okay? Hard to predict technological change. I write a lot about how hard it is to get predictions around technological change right. So don't blame him for that too much. What has always interested me more is this capital M mind thing he does. It's like, because I always got this vibe that he thought this new technological system was coming and we were all headed somewhere together. Like, collectively, we were going to have this capital M mind that was going to bring us all together, kumbaya, and we're just heading into the utopian sunset. And then I realized when I was digging deeper, maybe I knew this and forgot it. I don't know what's going on here. But what he's drawing on is the Jesuit priest Teilhard de Chardin, who had this idea. He was a evolutionary theorist, kind of, who combined evolutionary theory with a very odd notion of teleological Christianity that was kind of like, though it's not just that God's going to come again and there will be end days. It's that it's a kind of progressive view where we're teleologically heading this thing he called the omega point. And we're doing that through something called the noosphere. So there's a biosphere, like, around the Earth. The noosphere is all of our minds interacting. And he thought the noosphere was going to end up becoming more unified together and cohesive over time. And I can't blame Teilhard's philosophy on LSD. It was too early for that. But we can say that as a young man, John Perry Barlow has taken a lot of shrooms and other stuff and reading Teilhard and really getting into it. And then he saw the internet and he said, this is it, okay? And so in 1994, he told this Usenix conference, he said, the internet is the coming omega point, that point at which human beings became so good at communicating with each other that they create what would amount to a capital C collective, capital O organism of capital M mind. All right. Now, I don't know if you've ever been on Twitter before, but I don't think that's what's happening with the internet. I don't know if you've seen a lot of studies of behavior on the internet. I don't us all coming together into capital M mind. I don't think that's how that's going. And what I go into in the essay is that he had thoughts about this, but he didn't bother to do his homework, because if he had looked at how social scientists actually studied the way humans use information going back to the 1930s and 1940s, studies of radio and early television and all these things, what he would have found is that people process information through the groups they're a part of. They're kind of tribally based group, part of networks. They interpret information through the groups they're a part of, okay? And not only that, but they also have what we call confirmation bias or motivated reasoning, which is that most of us, if we're realistic about the way we live, we go through the world glomming onto facts that support what we already believe anyway, and radically discounting anything that kind of potentially upsets our worldview. So much so that like you can put humans in giant magnets and their brains will heat up if you give them like data that kind of like comes against their things. Now, what I say in the essay is that what interests me really is that this is not a new, what I just outlined about confirmation bias and motivated reasoning is not a new insight about human being. Because you see it in Francis Bacon's Novum Organum of like, I don't know, I could find the date, it's in my computer. But like about 16 something, right? And he says, if you get into philosophy, a lot of people just pick the things that fit their fancies, their prior fancies is how it's often translated, right? And not only that, but apparently there's a Islamic thinker in the 12th century who said the same thing. Dante said the same thing, using like St. Thomas Aquinas as the mouthpiece to say the same thing. Thucydides said the same thing in ancient Greece. If you're a part of a wisdom tradition, and I think you can also say lots of Buddhist and other Eastern traditions say the same thing about us too, around this motivated reasoning confirmation bias thing. And so I'm not saying necessarily that if John Perry Barlow had been more realistic about what human beings are, then he would have recommended regulation, because I don't even know if that's the answer to these questions. But I do think if he had a better picture of human beings, he would have been much more cautious about these, like, it's all going to be great if we just leave it alone, because I don't think that worked out too well, actually, you know? And so, yeah, that's kind of what kind of my road into this. And I do think that I draw on wisdom traditions, but I also think like formal social science is often helpful. And I'm most happy when they kind of kiss in that way. And it's just like, oh, perfect. You know, like it's like a bunch of psychologists in the 1990s found this in very rigorous studies. And it happens to also be in the 12th century or whatever. That's good. So I don't know. I mean, I think instead of us talking to each other, we should just get these folks into the conversation. So yeah, why don't we go to Q&A? Yeah? Okay. I have so many questions for you. I could go for the rest of the time, but we'll see. But we want them to talk. You got a question? No, not yet. Hey.
So I don't know if this is working. So Lee, you began by saying that you didn't want to do an essentialist account of technology.
Yeah.
And then Mike gave us a very cautious account of the human that did step into what is its essence in some degree.
Of technology?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just wanted to ask you, Lee, whether or not you were with Mike on that. Having given us this anti-essentialist view of technology, or a kind of reluctance to talk about the essence of technology, are you reluctant or not reluctant about the essence of the human? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it's slightly different, yeah.
Right. So if you say essence and human in the same sentence, that is going to get a lot of people's hackles up. So I've tried not to do that in any sentence in this essay, right? I do think, I think it's tough actually because you were talking about enculturation and how much we know that like we're a product of our upbringing and stuff. And I do think it's actually really hard to know what is essential in some trans-historical way and what is enculturated. You know, the joke I make in the essay is like, it could be that a lot of Americans act like selfish jerks, right? But like, I don't think we want to go to the generalization, human beings are selfish jerks, which is the way some economists do for some reason. And, you know, it seems like, so I do think like, because I think we know that, for instance, just on that score, a lot of other cultures are more other oriented. So I don't know I think that there's reasons why this essence word like freaks people out, right? And so I didn't want to go there. So maybe I'm just being a coward, and I'm just going to embrace that cowardice up here right now. I don't know. What do you think about this essence word? I don't know.
There are a couple of things I want to say. So one, it goes back to this issue about how we allow people to express what we might think of as sort of religious or maybe theological convictions about the human, right? So I would say some things, speaking as a Christian about who we are as human beings. And I don't think that those claims that I would make would be necessarily contrary to reason, right? I don't think that would be inaccessible, right, to others. And I want to take seriously the fact that we live in a pluralist society, right? So this is part of the provisionality, right, of the claim. So I'd want to invite a conversation about these things, right? And you know, one of the places where I like to start, and I gesture toward this here, is simply the fact of our embodiment, right? And can we start there, right?
We can.
We're
can start
embodied
there,
creatures, right?
actually. Yeah.
You know, Barlow has a problem with our embodiment, right?
He does. Yeah,
Right?
he does.
This is, you know, it's flesh and steel,
Right.
mind, right?
Yeah, it's like disembodied spirit.
Yeah. The way you hear transhumanists talk about our meat sacks, right? With, you know, barely concealed disdain for our embodiment, right? So I would want to say, one, the fact of our embodiment, and I would want to add to that, theologically, I consider that embodiment is not just a fact of our existence, but it is actually good, right? It is a condition of our flourishing, not a constraint to be transcended, right? So this is the kind of way I would want to proceed with that conversation, right? Where can we find some things that through our experience, our common experience as human beings, we can sort of find some measure of agreement. This is not to say that we will all get to that kumbaya moment where on every point of detail we will agree. But what is, can we have a sufficiently robust account to work publicly in order to then begin to make public judgments about technology? That's sort of the project, the hope that we could do that, right? And I think by proceeding this way, maybe I'm overly optimistic, maybe I'm too hopeful, but I think we can get farther than I think most people would recognize, right. You know? Yeah.
I agree with you.
Yeah. Like you take electric lighting. Right? I like to use this example, right? Is it good for us, for who we are as these embodied creatures that live by the diurnal cycle, that require sleep for X number of factors that scientists have identified as sort of being essential to our embodied human condition as creatures? Finding out, discovering how sort of lighting plays with that diurnal cycle. Is there, like, can we make an argument, right, for how we think about lighting in our public spaces, right? There are also, and I would want to say too, that the degree to which we refuse to acknowledge our embodiment seems to also correlate to the degree which we disregard the welfare of non-human animals in the world, right? And so there are ways in which electric lighting also plays with natural habitats, right? So I think we can sort of proceed, bring in data, social scientific studies to go along with that. I don't think we can be reduced to social scientific studies, right? But however many voices that we can bring to this conversation, the better. Begin to flesh out a picture to guide us, right? Without even necessarily rising to the point where any of us need to say, oh, this is the essential human nature. But it's just beginning with a kind of thick description of human well-being and experience. Does that make sense? I hope that's not a cop-out.
Yeah, no, I think your list, you embodied, rational, moral, communal, dependent. I think that's fine. That's good. I agree. Yeah, I mean, that's a good place to start.
So we will regulate.
Yeah.
Entrust us with the power.
I think the only thing with communal is I think we have to recognize that like autistic and other folks who have different relations to sociality than other folks. But otherwise, I think that's a good starter kit. Yeah.
And I think with a lot of these, we have to make these same sorts, we have to hear these voices.
Right.
And recognize, well, I would not have thought about that based on my experience, but it is important to have these voices expand our understanding.
So I think discussions about the purpose of technology are quite interesting in theory, but I would like you to comment on whether they are actually relevant in practice. And so what I have in mind is, for example, that if a country sees the development of a certain technology as a matter of, national security, I find it hard to believe that they will stop developing that technology because of these kinds of discussions. So, for example, people have been talking endlessly about the development of AI, about the dangers of AI, maybe if we should stop developing it for a couple of years. But of course, every country says, if I stop doing it, other countries won't, and they will have a advantage that will produce that risk. So I would just like you to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk more about the politics of this. I mean, that's one question I have about from Mike too, is about kind of ethics and smaller scale decision making, maybe at the local community, say, and like large scale politics. But I mean, I just think power's real, right? And there's long traditions of even in our democratic society in the United States, for instance, there's long traditions going back at least to like the early post-World War II period of people saying we should put less money into the defense establishment and more into social programs and medicine and taking care of people, right? And those very often, for kind of dependable political reasons, those arguments don't get very far, and we continue to build fighter jets and stuff. And so I think that we have to be realistic that all these conversations happen in these large national and international geopolitical situations where there's a lot of asymmetries of power, right? So yeah, I mean, I just think that your point is right. Yeah.
I would agree. I usually approach this in terms of talking about differential agency, right? I have a measure of agency over certain choices. Other individuals may not have that same degree of agency, even over very local private choices regarding their technology use. As you sort of go up the level of complexity and more complex systems, certainly once you get into questions that nations deem matters of national security, I'm under no illusions that our conversation here is going to land on the desk of the president and radically alter the way that's their policy is conducted. I'm not so. So I would say you and I have choices that we're going to be able to make tomorrow. It's good to be informed about those. We should not deceive ourselves about the kind of power that we're able to wield in the world. But yet there are maybe collective measures that can be taken through a variety of means at the disposal of people, whether they be members of a union, right? Whether they be activists and organizers. Even here, we might say, well, their relative power compared to the military-industrial complex is relatively small. I would say here is where part of my own sort of theological conviction comes out, right? I think we pursue the good, recognizing these power asymmetries, and yet that doesn't preclude me from trying to elucidate what is the good, and to use whatever levers are at our disposal, but with a kind of acknowledgement that I have no illusions, right, about changing global politics, at least not in the instance. But I then also wonder about what kind of change is possible over a sufficiently long time scale, right? And so a lot of times we're thinking about what can I change tomorrow, or what can I change before the next presidential election? I sometimes like to encourage people to think, well, what might change in 100 years? And how would that change happen? Power of cultural change. Cultures do change, right? Values do change. Things happen to make cultures change, right? So maybe it is the great technological accident that causes us to rethink things, right? God forbid that it be an accident on the scale of nuclear exchange, right? But there's no guarantee that that wouldn't be the case, right? So that's a very long-winded way of saying, yeah, you're right. There are, again, power differentials of agency. I think we're called to do what we can in our relative spheres. Yeah.
So Mike, earlier you said a lot of moral significance in our life is not easy to quantify, so it's hard to measure what's moral, what's good. And that made me wonder, if we were to ask ourselves not what is good for us, but what is bad, like, do we know what is bad? If we don't know what it's good, can we name better what it's bad? And that made me think of a poem by an Italian poet, Eugenio Montale, who in the 1920s wrote a poem I studied in high school that I was desperately trying to Google now. I'll translate the last sentence for you. The only thing I can tell you today, it's ciò che non siamo, what we are not, e ciò che non vogliamo, and what we don't want. So the only thing I can tell you is what I don't, what we are not, and what we do not want. So I was trying to flip the idea of the good. If we were to look at the bad, do we sense what the bad is, what we don't want? Okay.
I think about how that's beautiful. Thank you. I think and again, just shout out to the humanities in a sense here, right? The power of very different voices to illuminate our quest for wisdom. I think about how a lot of times I'll give a talk about technology and just trying to give people categories to think with, as I try to make these judgments. And one response is like, I knew something was off, but I didn't have a language to describe it, right? So, but the point is that they had some sense that something was wrong, something was off. Sort of tried to go to this example now, but it's kind of ubiquitous, so it kind of works widely, right? That moment when you panic because you left your home without your smartphone, like, does that signal a disordered relationship, right? Something is wrong, something is off, right? Or we sense a kind of dependence on us. We find ourselves in an activity that, at the end of it, we're always like, why did I do? So I think yes, short answer, yes, I think there's something to that. I think we should still search for a language of the good, whether through poetry, the arts, philosophical discourse, or religious traditions. But certainly there is a starting point in saying, I know this is not good for me, and then proceed from there, towards a better. So it's like the via negativa for the good, right? Now.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. This like what's bad and whether we can start there and know what that is. And I think one little wiggle that Mike and I have slight differences on some topics, but we don't, it's always figuring out what they are actually is not easy. But I think that one difference is that just to give a concrete example that's very big right now is like teen mental health and its relationship to social media. Okay. My take is that the social scientific literature on this is extremely unclear. Like, we do not know, basically. Okay. And I think that the popular cases like Jonathan Haidt's book that kind of make this argument tend to kind of put their thumb on the scale. And there's been lots of criticisms from other scholars of technology saying like, this is not a balanced account of these issues, basically. Okay. Well, so I think if we're going to do something at the level of government in a democracy, like regulate, you need evidence of harm of some sort. I don't think we can just go on vibes on that level. I don't think that's going to stand up in court, blah, blah, blah. I think there's issues there. Does that mean, and I think this is where Mike and I agree, does that mean that just because like experts haven't like put their stamp, like we know this is harmful, we shouldn't like in daily life, in our own lives and in our family life and in the lives of like as parents with our children, shouldn't take action? I hope not. Right? I mean, I definitely limit my kids' screen time, and we have all kinds of ways of thinking about that. And I try to get away from my phone as often as I can. I mean, I go out, my parents have a camper on my property, and I just go out there and write, away from my devices. So I think that's one interesting split for me as like a historian of regulation. I think that you actually need some kind of evidence to do like big scale regulatory stuff. I think you better not just be running on vibes there. It's not going to hold up. But when it comes to like practical reason and just making wise decisions in your life, I don't see why that, the stamp of expertise needs to be like a limit to you. To your point, this kind of like, it's hard to quantify these things and you feel it. I mean, we were just talking at lunch with some grad students in my program about how often undergrad students like report suffering from TikTok or whatever, right? And so it's like, I don't know, you should maybe act on that basis. Like, don't wait for like a bunch of psychologists to come forward and say, well, we can prove it's real. I mean, I don't know. Yeah.
I don't know that there is a disagreement. I think.
What we're trying to figure out,
Yeah.
you know.
I'll say something really provocative.
Yeah.
But no, because I think you're right. I frame this as a problem, but it's the nature of the case, right? In our society, you do need sort of evidence to rise to the level of regulation or legal policy. I just urge people to make judgments. What is sufficient reason to make judgments in your own personal life, right? Yeah, which is I think we're basically in agreement with. And when I do find people who are like hesitating to make these judgments because again there's no expert seal of approval, I don't know. I want to encourage people to sort of get implicated in their lives and make that judgment call and take responsibility for it, right?
Yeah.
Following this, but on some level, you can make a judgment call if you have the knowledge or if you remember how things were before, let's say. And we are people our age, middle age. We remember before my but as a young person, how do you do that? Let's say if nobody around you sets a norm.
I mean, the grad students who we're talking with today, again, they were reporting that their students that they teach, they have some understanding that this is not good for them, right? I think I have a similar experience in I've taught middle schoolers, high schoolers, undergraduates. I think they kind of get that there's some disorder, the relation to some of these devices are disordered. I agree with you that having a foot in the before times and the after times gives you a kind of maybe analytic clarity. It's a unique position to be in because you have a little taste of both. So I think that is valuable. But increasingly, I think that there is a sense that something is not quite right, could be better, and maybe they just need a little bit of a language to name it or some concepts to kind of clarify their thinking about it. But I think because they are human, right? These are shared human concerns and questions. We share this kind of experience of the world, in large measure. Then there is going to be a response to a situation or a set of factors that is not conducive to human well-being, whether they've experienced the good or not. It is bad. I don't need to have had prior experiences with a cold to get my first cold and know this was bad for me, right? Or to break a bone for the first time and say, oh, that's bad for me. I don't know if that's a good analogy or not, but yeah.
Yeah, I feel like the undergrads I teach are just kind of, they might just be repeating narratives they're hearing around them, but they use before times language about what's changed. They might be getting that from their parents or other relatives or from the news. I think it's definitely different to hear a reportage on something and then experiencing yourself. I believe that, but I think there's a acute sense with these students. Not just like a sense that things are going wrong, but a reporting that they changed their behavior. Like a lot of my students say they don't have TikTok anymore because they were going down like rabbit holes for too long. So they've actually changed the way they do things. So
I will say I want to qualify because there are some cases where I think that not having the prior experience does matter, right? And one thing that comes to mind, a little sort of soapbox for myself is how few people have an experience of this sort of fully dark night sky, right? And to see, the starry heavens and their, in all their magnificence. If you have no sense of what's missing, right? This is just, you grew up in a urban setting. This is just what you know. I think you do need the experience of what you've not had before to recognize that you are actually, I don't know, maybe this is too strong, but kind of an impoverished position relative to the person who gets to experience that, or has experienced that at least, a handful of times or at least once in their life. So there, I'm looking for the name of a social scientific term, right, for how, our baseline gets reset and then we just sort of forget the before. So in some cases, I think I would say, as I said before, we just know because we feel it, something is off. But I do actually, then upon further reflection, think there are cases where having had no prior experience of an alternative, we just sort of say, oh, well, this is just the way life is, right? And we do need that experience to tell us, oh, actually, there's something better or different. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more.
Nobody else has one. I'll ask you a question.
Yeah, good.
Mike, you mentioned kind of in your list of essentials to keep in mind, dependency, and then pitted that a little bit against autonomy. And I think that there's a good tension between those, or maybe an opposite between those. But it occurred to me that there's also a perversion of dependency. So there's good dependency and bad dependency. And so I was wondering if maybe you could draw a distinction between bad dependency and autonomy as the relationship with good dependency. And then is there a perversion and an opposite to some of the other characteristics on your list?
That's interesting, yeah. So part of me wants to say, there's this guy named Ivan Illich, so big fan of, or I'm a big fan of his work. And there's this kind of fruitful tension in his work, because I think he talks about, well, he has this term for what he calls the disabling professions. These are the experts that come in and say, I'm now the expert of this realm. And in these areas where human beings felt a measure of competency to address their needs through mutual support or self-sufficiency, now they are made to feel as if they are inadequate to these very basic human functions, right? So I'll very briefly share like the story that drives this home very, powerfully. I was teaching about Illich. I had a grad student. He was a student at UF, and he was in a lab. He was in biological sciences. He was in a lab. So it's a tragic story. So, part of it, the story is that in the context of that lab, one of their colleagues passed away. Right? So very traumatic, obviously traumatic moment. This is a small cohort, 4 or 5 people, they gather together. The student is among them. And they begin to do what I think human beings instinctively know to do: comfort one another, right? Comfort each other in the midst of this tragedy. One of them sort of raises the objection that maybe we shouldn't be doing this until the mental health professional arrives. All right. And so this is not to say anything against mental health professionals, right? Good, necessary, important, right? But it is to say there is a kind of dependency there that maybe is not a healthy dependency, right? We should not feel as if we need a specific certified counselor to be present with us to simply offer consolation to one another in the way that human beings have done since time immemorial, right? So yes, I think you're right. There are ways in which and this is, I think I alluded to this in I think talking a little bit about Simone Weil and needs. There are ways we are made to feel dependent, which we ought not to feel dependent. This is, I think, a large part of the problem that we have, and maybe even contributes to the mental health crisis that we're experiencing, because we have not recognized maybe the capacity that we have to help each other. Like for Illich, it was a kind of a measure of autonomy in the service of interdependence, right? To help one another through these issues. So I don't know if we want to go through that list.
No, I mean, I think, there's all kinds of, rationality and morale. I mean, there's bad ways to be moralistic, right?
Yeah.
And there's bad ways to be communal, like you can be a bunch of Nazis. And, I think for all of these, there's like sick versions of it, right?
Like I'm a good Aristotelian, right? So there's never like this one virtue and then the vice, right? It's always a mean between two ways of going wrong, right? And so, yeah, I think maybe we can run a similar sort of analysis here. Yeah. I don't know if I'm a good Aristotelian or not, but yeah.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. You can reach us with questions, comments, and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or by following me on Twitter at sts_news or on YouTube at People's Things. Our podcast is distributed by the New Books Network, the leading platform for academic podcasts, so that you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Peoples and Things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show, I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Joe Fort is the producer for the podcast, and Mandy Lamb is the production assistant. This podcast and other Peoples and Things programming are produced in affiliation with Virginia Tech Publishing and supported by the Center for Humanities and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. For the entire Peoples and Things team, I am Lee Vinsel. And most importantly, I want to thank you for listening. Thanks.
Thank